Right, everybody, I think we'll make a start. I'm Bill Sherman, Director of the Warburg, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second of two lectures on the intertwined histories of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes, delivered by Betsy Sears as part of the Courtauld's Visiting Expert Program. I especially want to thank Alex Bovey and her colleagues from the Courtauld for arranging these lectures and indeed funding them. And of course, we're all grateful to Betsy for making the time to come for more than a week to give not only two talks, but also a postgraduate seminar on the extraordinary archives here at the Warburg that she knows so well and described to me last week as the most complete, and correct me if I get this wrong, most complete institutional archive of any humanities institute, something along those lines. Yeah, and I'm going to go with that until people challenge it. So now, Elizabeth Sears is the George H. Forsyth Junior Collegiate Professor and Department Chair of the History of Art at the University of Michigan. Her recent publications range very widely in more traditional areas: reading medieval images, the art historian and the object, study of the pioneering scholar William Heckscher, and an account of iconography and iconology at Princeton. Very strong line of institutional history and pedagogical and methodological history in her work. But here at the Warburg, she's best known for her detailed historical analysis of the creation and impact of A.B. Warburg's Institute for Kulturwissenschaftliche, or Cultural Sciences, first in Hamburg and then here in London. She's published many pieces on that subject over the last few years, teaching us a lot as she does so, and we eagerly await the magnum opus, Warburg Circles 1929 to 1964. Now, last week's lecture at the Courtauld was called The Warburg and the Courtauld, Imbricated Histories, and it took the story from the mutually reinforcing establishment of both institutions in the early 30s up through roughly the end of the Second World War, when the building we are now sitting in was becoming a dream in the University of London's eye. And it was originally, of course, intended to take the form of a pair of twin modernist palazzi that would have housed both the Warburg and the Courtauld and occupied the entire side of Woburn Square. We still think that might be a good idea. This week's talk is called The Courtauld and the Warburg, Complementarities, and promises to take the story forward into the exciting periods of Blount, Gombrich, and others. Now, I hope we'll have time for some questions at the end, and then we'll definitely have time for some drinking at the end. We'll move downstairs to a reception in Betsy's honor in the common room. But for now, please join me in giving Elizabeth Sears a warm Warburg welcome.
So huge pleasure to be here, and I do want to thank Alex and Fern and the Courtauld people for having put me up so royally and giving me such a very interesting occasion and a chance to speak. Last week, in the first lecture, we followed what I called, and what Bill has reminded us was called, the imbricated early histories of the Courtauld and Warburg Institutes. It emerged that the really quite unlikely transfer of a rich, if idiosyncratic, German library embodying a specific methodological trajectory was accomplished in 1933. We learned that it emerged in good part owing to the actions of those who had brought the Courtauld Institute into existence in 1932. The drawing on the screen, to which Bill just referred, is a post-war architect's vision of the two institutes residing under the same roof, a plan conceived in the 30s, given a boost in the 50s, never to be realized, the Courtauld half remaining unbuilt. The idea even here was not to amalgamate, but to juxtapose the two institutes. There would have been two doors, two libraries, two photo collections. This was seen as a logical coordination, a fostering of appropriate collaboration. Which brings us to today's theme of complementarities. If the last lecture was something of an annotated chronicle, this one will be thematic in thrust, And this one, to be frank, was a little harder to craft. I've been trying to read documents obliquely to get at assumptions about method and pedagogical philosophy, to gather evidence of perceptions of task. Now, the 1930s, you'll recall, saw both institutes making their way in an academic environment that was hardly persuaded by art history's claims to rigor. The Courtauld, which opened its doors in Portman Square in Samuel Courtauld's 18th century home, was introducing a discipline into the academic mix, forging new grounds with its degree programs. These were the chief players: Lord Lee, Sir Robert Witt, Samuel Courtauld, along with the first director, the academic among them, W.G. Constable. The Warburg Institute, arriving in London from Hamburg, was installed first in a spanking new office block, Thames House, and I always liked that the staff entered daily beneath the triumphal arch. The chief players were Fritz Saxl and Gertrude Bing, who were an item, and the philosopher art historian Edgar Vint, who severed ties with the Institute in 1945, quite dramatically. The Warburgians were, of course, endeavoring to adapt for Britain methods that were not new by any means, but had been developed in Germany in response to an already long and complex tradition of art historical study. Both institutes were trying to recruit participants, find apt audiences. It was a time for defining models, and clearly they did so with and in contradistinction to one another. We can rightly, I think, speak of a meeting of academic cultures, a phenomenon quite as interesting as the many other forms of cross-cultural exchange so much studied today. In the domain of academics as well, it's a matter of perceptions and misperceptions and their role in individual identity formation, in belonging. So today I hope to think about lines laid during crucial decades in the development of the discipline of art history in Britain. The issues remain very much alive. I'll be moving, as was said, into the post-war decades. Many of you, I'm sure, and maybe in discussion after, will be bringing things up to the present. We've all developed over the years our own perceptions of difference and potential points of contact between the sister institutes. To start us thinking, I think we've got now Saxl and Constable on the screen. Trying to decide how to do this, I thought we might begin with the story of an unrealized venture. Namely, the plan concocted in 1934 by Saxl and Constable to secure the German Jewish art historian Erwin Panofsky for London. This is a what-if story. What if Panofsky had chosen England over the United States? London over Princeton? Would Panofskyan iconology in Britain have taken on anything like the shape it did when Hamburgian seeds were planted in very fertile American soil? Would the books have been written in the same mode? Would iconology have become the international phenomenon it did? The story, as I hope, can lead us to think about iconography, its study in England. It's an element of art historical practice that even in the 1930s was seen to connect teaching at the Courtauld and research at the Warburg Institutes. So maybe some background quickly. Panofsky and Saxl were close friends in Hamburg. Between 1920 and 1933, they collaborated intensely. Panofsky later looked back and said the 13 years were almost like a marriage. Jacques Sol always admired and was a little jealous of or surprised by Panofsky's productivity and the great clarity of his thinking. He felt he never worked better with anybody else. Their first salvo, you might say, of 1923 was the study of sources and pictorial types behind Dürer's Melancholia, and in the 1930s, they were still working towards a second edition of this book. Together, and we know a lot more now because Panofsky Correspondence has been published, together we know that these two young men, as the soon-to-be director of the Warburg Library in Hamburg and the first professor, the ordinarius at Hamburg, the two had tried to come to terms with A.B. Warburg's art and cultural historical investigations. And really what I think you could say is they were trying to lift out of A.B. Warburg's fragmented project, his incomplete endeavors, that which could serve a general and a teachable art history. Warburg's inimitable. You had to find those things that could be codified and taught. Together, the two had fostered, with the help of others, the emergence of a distinctive Hamburg school of art history, one where pictorial content was studied in conjunction with pictorial form, and the visual arts were studied in their relation to other aspects of culture. Instruction was at a high level. Here are some student notes from a seminar on Quellenforschung that was given by Panofsky and Jacques Sol in the Warburg Library in 1932. So this is the research into sources, Quellen. I don't mean you to read all this list, but let's just marvel at the way a taxonomy had been created, classes of written documents that students were to absorb and mobilize in their art historical study. Look, we have unintentional description of fictive artworks, reports on origins, and look, the report of Sujet, of Abbot of Saint-Denis, not yet well translated. That's coming soon. Epigrams, legends, and so on. So this is what students were learning as they came out of the Gymnasium, out of their Grosses Latinum, as they came to develop their skills in Kunstwissenschaft. So my point is only how well thought out the methods were, and it's clear why Jacques Sol, who had collaborated with Panofsky, would have wanted him to come to London. But Constable wanted Panofsky as well. He had met Panofsky maybe even earlier, but he met up with him in January 1934 when Panofsky passed through England, and he gave some lectures at the Courtauld precisely on iconography in the Renaissance. This is what they were thought to be good at. Constable made his case to Lord Lee, quote, "I most sincerely hope that we shall be able to secure Panofsky for the staff of the Institute. He is recognized everywhere as one of the best art historians living. As you know, his attitude towards the subject is that it passes far beyond the bounds of simple connoisseurship and must be studied as part of general cultural history of mankind." Constable tried hard. He tried fundraising. He went to Benjamin Guinness, who had given a little money at one point to bring the Warburg Institute here, and he got a resounding no. Benjamin Guinness said he wanted to put his money into art objects and not into art history. Still, by the end, a plan was cobbled together, and Panofsky would have worked between the Courtauld and the Warburg, teaching at the Courtauld, doing research at the Warburg, and it would have been funded by the Academic Assistance Council, Rockefeller Foundation, and a private source. Okay. But Panofsky had options. He had been teaching a little in America, as you know. In Princeton, Charles Rufus Morey was cooking up a deal that proved difficult, indeed impossible, to refuse. It included free housing and free university education for his kids. Okay, so on March 5th, 1934, Constable sent a cable, can you postpone decision on Princeton, offer pending, efforts to arrange appointment here of at least £600 per annum for 7 years. They waited. On March 17, Constable wrote to Saxl, probably this weekend will decide whether we succeed or fail. And they failed. However much Panofsky, in his words, hated to be cut off from Europe, he stayed in the US. And very soon, the Institute for Advanced Study was founded, and he swan in to that illustrious organization. So Panofsky apologized, he showed his gratitude, but privately, in correspondence to friends in America, he expressed other feelings. We may recall last time I showed you this clipping that Lord Lee had rather lampooned British attitudes toward art, the distrust of anything highbrow. Remember, he said, it is not that our people are less intelligent or naturally less appreciative of art than their foreign contemporaries, da-da-da-da. Panofsky, privately, in private correspondence, was more artfully condemning. So here's to Alfred Barr, the director of MoMA, his wife. He knew Margaret Barr very well. You're reading ahead. Okay, so what do we have here? The general attitude of the English towards art is absolutely different from, if not hostile to, the continental one. They consider a work of art either as an object of aesthetic appreciation, collecting, attributing, poetical paraphrase or ekphrasis, or as a purely historical document, but not as an object of interpretation. It is a kind of gentlemanly attitude, and I have a feeling that they regard our means of approach as an almost obscene thing. You can love a woman or you can establish her family history, but you cannot analyze her mental and physical qualities in public. He had decided to set his hopes on the US. And in October 1934, he wrote to one of the American Warburgs, quote, "It seems clear that, thanks to the German exodus, this country is going to be, or I should say, this country is going to be the only place where European scholarship can survive or revive." It sounds, I was thinking, like an exam question. Could continental scholarship thrive in England? Discuss. Iconography, a Hamburg specialty, it was known to be so, was a subject at the Courtauld from the outset. But what did it connote? That becomes an interesting question, which we'll try to get at a little bit. Here's the BA honors course, that 3-year course that the Constable thought was such a failure, at least initially. Students unprepared, ill-prepared, and difficult to teach. So I put in red, history of aesthetic theories and of the criticism of art, or iconography and the history of costume. And that coupling is interesting and significant. One, it is the specialty of the deputy director, Mr. J.G. Mann, as expert in armor, and he put down iconography and costume history, so they went together. Blount was the one who would have been teaching theories of art and criticism of art. But here now, extracts from a Courtauld lecture list, very much at the beginning, 33, 34, just after the émigrés had come, their second year. This is how Panofsky was to have been integrated. I can't find that he gave all these lectures, but this is what they wanted from him, the way they saw it working. Panofsky and Mann, iconography of the Renaissance, iconography and costume, medieval. And then Blount and Panofsky on theories of art. Now, Panofsky and Mann together, this is quite interesting. And I think that from this contrast, one can get quite a bit, because there are many points of comparison. In 1933, Mann published an article, as you see, Instances of Antiquarian Feeling in Medieval and Renaissance Art, in the Archaeological Journal. All this is, the language, the place, all of it's very interesting. 1933, the same year, the famous, now I think, article, Classical Mythology and Medieval Art, came out in Metropolitan Museum Studies in New York written mostly by Panofsky, but he collaborated with Saxl because so much of the information was based on Saxl's research. It's a rather beautiful contrast, these two articles, and I really won't do justice to it here, but I'll bring out a few things. The British essay opens by naming an English antiquarian. The Germanic essay opens with reference to Italian humanists. The authors, all three, were interested and amused by the fact of medieval anachronism. And they were on the hunt, both of them, all of them, for increasing efforts of artists, culminating in the 16th century, to get costume and attributes right, to get them archaeologically correct, proper to period. And they each introduced many instances and sometimes the same instances. That much linked them. But for the British scholar, the question became one ultimately of changing taste. And the utility, and this was where costume history came in particularly, was for connoisseurial work and for detecting forgery. Accuracy and inaccuracy served these ends. For the Hamburg scholars, and Panofsky in particular, it was a mean to discover general cultural patterns, to distinguish European renaissances one from another, to define the medieval mind and the Renaissance spirit, and to chart big shifts in mentalities. The Panofsky-Saxl article had started as a talk that Panofsky gave at Princeton, and there was ecstatically received. Panofsky, we read in a letter, spoke for 2 hours, the students clapped for 10 minutes, and the Princeton medievalist, Charles Rufus Maury, said, "I've been a medievalist all my life, and I'm absolutely overwhelmed." This is the reception, not of everyone, but of a swath of people in the United States. America loves a hero, and many of these emigres served that function. But now let's get another opinion. And let's go to Britain, because it turns up in correspondence, a kind of interesting reaction. And this one from Otto Pest, emigre Austrian art historian, Saxl's good friend here, who had worked some in the Warburg Institute, but had settled in Oxford in the war years, where he would teach until the early 60s, when he'd returned, surprisingly, to Vienna. He was an early and still well-known critic of Panofskyan iconology. It was in 1941, early in the war, that he came upon the essay we're talking about, Classical Mythology in Medieval Art, as written by Panofsky and Saxl. He wrote to Saxl, "I like the article very, very much, up to the point where the more general reflections about the Renaissance spirit, etc., set in. The end is too much Panofsky for my taste, and not a good one either." But then perhaps Saxl was beginning to change too, taking on local coloring here in Britain a bit. In Britain, his own relish for the concrete and his self-described pragmatic approach could thrive. And here's his reply to Pest. "I was greatly relieved that you liked the old article on classical mythology. I think you can clearly see from the contents that the main thing which I contributed, so far as I contributed anything, was the earlier part about the astronomical manuscripts. I myself object strongly to the rather flat second part." So at the Courtauld, it seems, what Panofsky would have called iconography in the narrow sense was recognized as a necessary aid, ancillary skill. Iconographical identifiers are essential even for cataloging, and the Courtauld had a growing collection of study photographs and slides, to be sure. I stumbled across this in the Princeton Index of Christian Art guest book, visitor's book, here in 1933. W.G. Constable from University of London comes. Helen Woodruff introduces him, and he's after information about our method of indexing. So this is iconography for identification, for creating taxonomies, for, I think, organizing collections of materials. But it was more than that, because Hamburg modes were beginning to penetrate. After Constable resigned from the Courtauld, as you recall, in protest against inadequate intellectual standards, he published Slade lectures he had given in the book Art History and Connoisseurship. And at one point, as he goes through the objects and methods of art history, he defends iconography and feels he has to defend it, which is the interesting thing, because he's aware he's going against the grain in the British culture, British ambient. He notes that it is fashionable to decry the importance of the subject, but he argues that this is in fact necessary knowledge, especially if the object of study is not only a work of art, but it is a work studied as a document which throws light on other sides of man's activity. This means he is in touch with the Warburgians, and he particularly cites Panofsky's study of the Arnolfini portrait, which had appeared in the Burlington magazine in 1934 by way of example. So British art was moving to, as you'd expect, I'm just bringing out specific documents showing this progress or this change. In 1938, Constable's successor, Tom Bowes, consulted with Jacques Sol about the Courtauld BA syllabus, and he wrote, as you read, "The syllabus has now reached its final form. As far as the Board of Studies is concerned, the most important change is a rubric. In all papers, knowledge will be required of the subject matter of works of art in relation to their general historical background." So that's interesting, don't you think? And Bowes also sponsored the writing of textbooks. And he called in the aid of Warburgians, and this was part an act of charity because a lot of the emigres were really hurting for position, hurting for any kind of payment salary. And the two old friends who were friends for life, Gombrich and Otto Pest, who knew each other from Vienna days, Austrians who had arrived in the 30s and would end up respectively as the director and head librarian at the Warburg Institute later, they collaborated on precisely these textbooks. And the one that they nearly brought to completion, but then the war happened and so it wasn't published, was a handbook on iconography for the benefit of Courtauld students. So you went to the Warburgians for iconography. All this suggests what's not surprising, but again, I'm just trying to bring out detail. The Courtauld saw the Warburg certainly as a home of iconography, and indeed, there's ample evidence that the reputation of the Warburg was one of extreme iconographical learning, and it became the go-to place for any kind of solving of pictorial enigmas. So here's one. The Warburg Institute moved from Hamburg, as we say, in December 33, January 34, before the crates were even unpacked in Thames House. Kenneth Clark, who was just becoming the director of the National Gallery, posed his first problem to the Warburgians. He wrote, "What did the Warburg staff make of the pseudo-Mason's mark in grisaille on the bottom right-hand corner of the back of the National Gallery's just acquired painting, the massive Saint Gilles?" It just came in at that point, very famous. So he thought, here's a symbol of great oddness and strangeness. Maybe the Warburgians will know. And then the amount of Kenneth Clark correspondence up there is enormous. It goes on and on and on through 5 directors. And he is, not in a weekly way, but periodically over this time, he sends them a great number of esoteric queries. The subject might be representations of the Vestal Virgin Tuccia, or the allegory of hope, Or he might ask, why is Judas supposed to have knocked over the salt in the Last Supper? Or what is the origin of the question mark? So this is what the Warburgians are going to be able to tell you. Clark's close friend, Roger Hinks, largely self-trained art historian, made very early use of the transferred library. He was in the Department of Ancient Art at the British Museum and got all involved in the Elgin Marble scandal. Sad life in many ways. He was fluent in German and very, very unusually abreast of continental scholarship. He tried to accommodate his research to what he thought the Warburgians were about, and this led to a course of lectures which was then published, Myth and Allegory in Ancient Art. So that's the perception of what the Warburg's about, myth, allegory, etc. You can see how that would be. But coming out of the British tradition, Hinks was also committed to the idea of the enlightened amateur. He himself was a great lover of Pater. He wrote art criticism for T.S. Eliot's journal Horizon. His diary entries, as I have said before and did in a publication, are really remarkable. Extraordinary witnesses, partially published to British life, art, culture in this period. And so let's just read a longish journal entry, but I think it's worth it. It's interesting. In gathering the materials for my lectures on allegory, I'm more and more impressed every day by the scope of the Warburg Library, not only by the actual wealth of historical documentation that it contains, but still more by the endless creative possibilities of the Warburgian conception of Kulturgeschichte. I must confess that I find the promise almost more striking than the achievement, notable as that undeniably is. It seems to me that Warburg, and he's talking about A.B. Warburg's forte, was to be an amateur in the best sense of the word. He knew the desiccating effect of over-specialized research and kept the Goethean or Burckhardian ideal of the humanities always before his eyes. I'm not so sure that his followers have the same breadth of vision. There was a slight tendency to become entangled in the higher curiosities of learning, such as Oriental astrology and the more recondite forms of Baroque emblem, and to forget the wider aspects of humanism. Don't you find that a nice tension? This love of the amateur, of the non-academic pursuit of arts, and the ability to be a critic outside of any academic apparatus or training, one. On the other hand, what an allure, this kind of Germanic learning. Hinks became a very active ally, and in time he would even write that the connections with the Warburg Library changed his life. He got on particularly well with Edgar Vint, smart man, the philosopher art historian of the group. And one thing they did together was to form a discussion group, which I find very interesting. Mostly English, but some German too. So it was going to be a mixed academic cultural organization. This was an effort, I think, on their part to really show and establish what was distinctive about the Warburg Institute, and particularly its program in fighting against disciplinary isolation, including the isolation of art history. Its purpose, as stated in a letter, was to discuss questions of methods of interrelation between different fields of research and the possible collaboration between scholars in these different fields. The initial cohort consisted of a biologist, a chemist, a psychologist, an economist, and a sociologist, as well as historians of art, music, and philosophy. Quite bold for the time, and could be imitated now, for example. And this just gets now to a funny story. One whom they invited to attend was, then still at Cambridge, young Anthony Blount. He was self-training in art history. The evening in question, and they already knew him somewhat, the evening in question was going to be devoted to a talk by the Marxist sociologist Francis Klingender. Blount asked if he might bring a friend along, and that friend was no other than Guy Burgess. Truly. whom he described as a really great art historian. It'd be very interesting. As you know, those of you who are laughing know, and those of you who don't, that they were two of the Cambridge Five, which was the great notorious spy ring of the wartime era and into the post-war era. In 1936, when the Warburg discussion group started, Burgess, but not yet Blount, was talent spotting for the Soviets. So Klingender's talk, it seems, was viewed as a recruitment op. That's so funny. The Warburgians themselves were talent spotting in these years, and I think the word can be used. Their ideology was methodological. They were seeking adherents who would join the cause of humanist inquiry. And so now I'm kind of moving toward the issue of pedagogical philosophy and missionary aims. Warburgian strategies and anxieties are witnessed in the recruitment of Blount's friend, Ellis Waterhouse, who would be always a friend of the Warburg Institute and collaborate on the Warburg Courtauld Poussin drawings catalogue raisonné. Saxl, though, had plans for him. This was a little too close to the war, so nothing really materialized, but he had plans. So the first step was to arrange a heart-to-heart conversation. And Saxl, afterward, took the second step, which was to continue his pitch in a follow-up letter. He spoke frankly of the structural problems. The existing staff was made up of foreigners who lacked experience in English university life. Saxl worried that the Warburgians were coming into closer contact with museum people than with younger students. Quote, "This is the generation which really matters." What they hoped is that Waterhouse would act as a kind of liaison with Oxbridge, helping to send students their way. "Limitless work," he said, "is waiting for the workmen." And then he turns to, what would the advantage be for you, Ellis Waterhouse? He starts by listing the various projects that Vint and Witkover and Gombrich are doing. And then he made a vow of commitment. Every one of us would be delighted to do whatever he can to help you to develop your own work. This may not sound like very much, but I have now had 23 years' experience in this institute, which gives me confidence to say that up till now, every serious attempt at collaboration in the form we discussed today has been successful. And this is the pattern. This is what Warburgians liked to do. Give their all to individualized help and training, to shape scholars, to bring them from a good place to a better place. They wanted to recruit and bring into the fold significant scholars, and once in the circle, you received a lot, and you also were expected to give a lot. You were part of a real exchange of favors. Particular success was Anthony Blount, more than Waterhouse, who, as I say, was amenable, but there wasn't really time. Blount's development as an art historian depended in a great many ways with contact with the Germans in the Warburg circle. Witkover was more important to him, I'd say, than Vint, obviously Saxl too, and Friedlander as the Poussin specialist. Saxl first talent spotted Blount in February 1935. Having heard the 28-year-old give one of his lectures, we saw them, on art theory at the Courtauld. Blount had embarked on a study of artistic theory that would develop into a doctoral thesis on the history and theories of painting in Italy and France, 1400 to 1700, with special reference to Poussin. Now, at this moment, Blount himself was, as he later wrote, in flux. His, quote, personal consciousness was changing as with the rise of fascism, the political climate heated up, and his Cambridge circle went Marxist. His way of approaching art historical material, that of the aesthete, had come to seem catastrophically naive. Roger Fry, Clive Bell, and the rest had too long had their way. He was beginning to derive sustenance from the Hungarian émigré Friedrich Antal, a friend of the Warburgians from German days, and Klingener in particular. In 1937, Blount wrote a hard-hitting essay, Art Under Capitalism and Socialism, in which intellectual workers were called upon to expose ramifications of the capitalist profit principle. In January 1937, Blount was recruited by Soviet intelligence to work for the cause of international communism. In April of the same year, he received an overture from Jacques Sol. He moved to London, and during the period 1937 to 1939, he worked at the Warburg Institute. It was a time when he was inactive on the Soviet side, and this seems to have had to do with Stalin's purges. Lord Lee seems to have objected to his appointment. The Warburgians were untroubled by his left-leaning politics. Blount served them as director of publications. They needed a native speaker on the staff very much. He simultaneously supported himself by writing art criticism for The Spectator, lots and lots of it, and lecturing at the Courtauld. But he began, and you see this in the letters, to adopt a Warburgian persona. He was a man of causes. He became one of the workmen. He began to speak in terms of we and our. The Warburgians were preparing Blount for a career, this is clear. And when in October 1937, he received an offer to supervise Courtauld students, diploma, BA, and MA, and PhD, Jacques Sol urged him to do so on the grounds that it would put him in a good position when Tom Bowes arrived to direct the Courtauld a few months later, so strategizing with him. That this post led to a place on the Courtauld Board of Studies, made the Warburgians happy, and Blount saw it, quote, as a useful body from the point of view of getting into the organization of the Institute. So they had plans. In a testimonial he wrote for Blount, this was for a position at Cambridge that he didn't get, Jacques Sol recognized and he articulated differences between English and Germanic academic values. I think it's a very interesting piece. So he was writing for Blount, of course, and so he cast positively Blount's independence from continental models. In short, Britain couldn't do continental artistry. He praised the book's rhetorical lightness of touch. Readability, the émigrés were learning, was a British criterion of excellence. And Blount, in a certain way later, in different contexts, the preface of this book, returned the favor by praising his mentors. He wrote, quote, "In the process of working with the members of this institute, I have had the inestimable advantage of seeing a really scientific method consistently applied, and any features of this book which are not wholly amateur are due to this example." So again, we get amateur and academic, but here amateur is going down as a criterion. One-on-one mentoring is as expensive as it is effective. But the Warburgians saw this kind of training as core to their mission. This is made clear in a document that last time I said I'd turn to in this lecture. It's a detailed statement by Jacques Sol, 12 pages in length, addressed to Lord Lee as head of the Courtauld Committee. He is articulating differences between the missions of the Courtauld and the Warburg Institutes as he saw them. Quite a surprising thing to have exist, I guess I'd say. The date is July 8, 1936. This was a time of crisis for both institutes, as we recall. You remember that the Warburg's initial 3-year arrangement was coming to an end, eviction from Thames House loomed, funding was about to cease, and the Courtauld was suffering from the resignation of the first director, Constable, who, with a subcommittee, had advocated ending the very small BA honors program and siphoning off the more dilettantish members of the diploma program. Okay, diploma course. In this, Constable lost, Lord Lee, Sir Robert Witt, and Samuel Courtauld won the day. Remember, Lee approached the Warburg Institute for more collaboration, even asked Jacques Sol to step in as director of the Courtauld. That failing, he helped to orchestrate a new deal, and a deal that would tighten the alliance of the two institutions. Jacques Sol was worried about the form the alliance would take, so he wrote this memorandum. I'll put up a few quotes because I think they're interesting. But the Courtauld Institute, this is right from the middle of it, as opposed to the Warburg Institute, ought to be something more than an educational institute insofar as it should become the central art historical institute in England. It must therefore also concentrate on contributing to the international world of art history by giving access to the purely English historical material. In recent years, it has been realized on the continent that an adequate history of European art cannot be written before the essential facts of English art history have been made clear, and they are far from being clear at present. So here's your mandate. Do English art history, get the monuments known, do the basic research, become a research institute as well as a teaching institute. He may have talked to Courtauld about that, to Constable about that. With respect to students, Jacques Sol said, our attitude to the student coming from other branches of the university, and now he's doing a subset of students, is very different from that which should be adopted by the Courtauld. We must assume that the student has already tried his hand in one or another specialized field of learning, but what we can add is an indication of methods of approach to the whole wide range of historical knowledge. This can only be done by practical advice, not by lecturing. The student has to spend a certain but not too limited time in the institute on working out a single detailed problem. By so doing, he learns how to handle books containing very different information and how to coordinate his own method with the methods of other historical sciences. It is a matter of learning a method rather than acquiring many facts. So there's the pedagogical philosophy in a nutshell, and as I say, very expensive. Jacques Sol said he was apologetic about the theoretical nature of his considerations, but this was to prove the point, quote, that unification of the two institutes would be harmful to both. That's been a running motif over the decades, I would say, and that's been the normal thought, I believe, on both sides. He was adamant about the interdisciplinary focus of the Warburg Institute. Art history is an essential part of the Warburg Institute, but only a limited part. Hence, the Institute should coordinate their efforts. And what were his ideas? Well, here's one. The Institute should have a common plan of work. For instance, if the main subject for the term at the Courtauld Institute were Gothic art, the courses and lectures at the Warburg Institute that term should deal with problems of the history of philosophy or theology connected with the rise of Gothic art. But whereas the lectures at the Courtauld would be given mainly by its permanent staff and would go on regularly from week to week, the lectures at the Warburg Institute would remain as they are now, only once a month, and for the most part given by external lecturers. The courses arranged at varying intervals as before. So he's saying, maintain the status quo at the Warburg Institute, but we'll concede some. Did it ever work? Well, not really, and things were going to change very soon because the Warburg Institute was about to be integrated into the university. But during the war, in the war years, there is some evidence of collaboration along these lines. Here are photographs from a document of one of the wartime exhibitions of the Warburg Institute. Portrait in character. This one was put together first at the National Gallery. Kenneth Clark had pushed it. And I give here the figures speaking in a course of public lectures. So this is more, the Warburg did something and Courtauld lectures supported it, but it's the same kind of collaborative thinking Jacques Sol's getting at. those lecturing, Kenneth Clark, Wilde, Saxl, Münz, Blount, Gibson, and Pevsner, are quite the heavy hitters of this era, you would say. I would have liked to hear that. German and British, and that's also interesting. Now, at the same time, distinctions were becoming clear. I threw this in at the last moment. I just came upon this letter a very few days ago in reading some of the correspondence of Edgar Vint from the war years when he was in America. And so this is 1941, the time of the Blitz. And in hindsight, I think it's kind of prescient. It kind of says it all. Saxl is saying to Vint, just by the way, it's a long letter, the Courtauld Institute is very much alive. They have lunch hour lectures every week, which are very well attended. The common subject was classicism. That's certainly something that would link them. Blount enjoys being in charge of the Institute and is doing much in spite of his official other duties. And then we could add his official and his non-official duties going on right then. I think the Institute was never as much alive as it is at present, which is interesting. We all lectured there, Wittkover, myself, Pevsner, Antal, etc. This is even before the event I talked about. But in a way, Blount has become more separated from us, more Courtauld than he was before. As I said, the Courtauld has now become his own institute, and he's settling down to it, even sleeps there. Wittkover, with his interests in pure art history and Poussin and the history of architecture, forms a link between the two institutes. But there is, of course, a certain danger that he's gliding back into straightforward art history. So you really see they are defining one another in contradistinction to the partner, I think. And trends are beginning to emerge. Now, after 44, when the Institute was, as we well know, incorporated by trust deed into the University of London, the Warburg people suddenly had to start teaching undergraduates. The staff put together a 2-year course, The Civilization of the Italian Renaissance. Makes sense. It was started by Saxl and Wittkover, continued by Gombrich and Francis Yates. Gained 2 students the first year and 11 the second. Saxl had anticipated low numbers, and he was correct. They ran into some of the same problems that Constable had encountered at the Courtauld. We recall, those of you who were at the last lecture, Constable went on about the radical unpreparedness of students. So Saxl wrote in a letter, the difficulties of explaining the history of the revival of classical antiquity to students who have learned so little about antiquity while at school are very great. This teacher often first has to supply the most primitive knowledge of the classics. Teaching must be slow, and the number of facts taught, texts read, works of art discussed, carefully selected and severely restricted. Yet such a course, having humanism as its subject, seems to fulfill a useful purpose in a period when historical studies are inclined to concentrate on the study of political, constitutional, and economic aspects of historical development. So they were having their hard times. Certainly this wasn't like teaching Quellenforschung with Panofsky in pre-war Hamburg with German students arriving, gymnasium education in place. So as I wind up, let's just go back to where we started, the building and the continued expectation that though we see this sort of these differences and the kind of fragmentation, they belonged under the same roof. They were to be physically brought together in the Bloomsbury precinct. After the war, and in anticipation of this physical merger, it really was thought to be nearly to happen. There was a sharing of resources. In 1945, the Warburg made over to the Courtauld 4,150 slides because the Courtauld would need them for the teaching collection. Reciprocally, the Courtauld donated large collections of photographs to the Warburg, including some 10,000 photographs, apparently, of ancient art in connection with the Conway bequest. Blount became the longtime, let's just see where the two institutes were. Blount became the longtime director of the Courtauld in 1947, the year before Saxl's death. His life as a spy was buried, perhaps as a form of masking or expiation. He would work tirelessly in the cause of art history. He was a very active surveyor of the king's and then the queen's pictures. And there's Kenneth Clark looking on. And generous teacher by all accounts, very much a leader in the field, sitting on every conceivable board. And here's an interesting thing I just came upon. Well, you can hardly see it. It's a letter that Blount wrote out to art historians, including Gombrich, who had by this time become the head of the Warburg Institute. And you don't need to read it, but what it is an invitation to come to the Courtauld and discuss the teaching of art history. So this is Blount gathering the art historians of Britain to the Courtauld. Here is the follow-up missive. He asked for information and said, this is the guest list, and I've got it now smaller. Think about the difference in such a short time between 1932, when the Courtauld is founded, and 1966, just how many departments of history of art had been formed. And Essex was just about to. Look through this, and we will see Dublin, 2 women, no other women. So the Irish are leading the way in gender balance at this point. Blount, through these years, did stay in regular contact with the Warburg Institute. There's a large correspondence back and forth, often about students and supervising and the rest. Frances Yates became a favored interlocutor. This, I believe, is the photograph when she is made Dame Frances Yates. So it's at an advanced age, but it shows them together. There are many letters between them because they were both, of course, working on pre-modern France, and he certainly wanted to share his research with her and the opposite. But it seems, to use Saxl words, that Blount was becoming more Courtauld than before. It's perhaps relevant that his favorite venue becomes the Burlington magazine. He publishes some 140 pieces of various lengths there, and one in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute in the post-war years. And so now let's go to the Warburg, because that's the building we're in now is the first part of this plan. Byng, soon followed by Gombrich, but Byng was the director when the building had to be built, when they had to get out of Imperial Institute buildings. Poor woman was compelled to consider every detail of structure and design, every piece of furniture, every accoutrement down to the last ashtray. There were lots of these. And tea trolley with rubber wheels, this kind of thing. The accounts are moving in their funny way. She had to make the decision, I was going to show you the inside. And the outside, this would have been what it looked like on the Byng Place side. There might have been something more of a monumental entrance. The Courtauld then would have been on the right. And then here's the plan. Initial, because the reading room went in a different direction. So Byng had to pore over these and decide what to do. Here's the reading room, as it was then, not so different now. The curious smell of the Warburg Institute, have you always noticed this? I think it's because of the decision to clad everything in sapele mahogany. It's, I think, the wood. African straight-grained sapele mahogany. she concurred with the general opinion of the exterior. And doesn't it look now like half a building to you? I always accepted it as a structure, but now it just looks truncated to me. This is what the Manchester Guardian said. The finishing touches are now being put to the Warburg and Courtauld Institute. See, it was still one, even though the Courtauld wasn't going up, it was still thought to be one, in the University Precinct in Gordon Square. It is a drab 6-story brick building which repeats the dullness of elevation of the new Students' Union building alongside. Somehow it seems especially offensive that a building devoted to the visual arts should so lack aesthetic appeal and style. No doubt there will be beautiful things within for students to see, but to the passerby it looks like a 1930 telephone exchange. The disappointment is all the stronger for those who remember that in the name of art, one of the most perfectly characteristic sets of houses by Thomas Cubitt was demolished on this site. So Bing agreed. She even said, yes, I think it looks like a telephone exchange in a letter. But she took pride in the interior, and the more I think about it, the more interesting this interior is. The structure that she created was the final fulfillment of the dreams of the refugees to transplant in Britain. It embodied the wisdom of the German past. She was the one who knew it better than anyone because she had personally supervised the last 5 moves of the library in Germany and over here. It kept moving in through the war and all, and had thought so much about sequence and order. So she could enshrine a vision. Of course, it had been honed over the years and there were new categories and so on, but the basic 4-story vision she could enshrine. So, as we say, above the ground floor, there were the floors that could capture the broad taxonomies and flows within a system, image, word, orientation, action. And there were embedded allusions, the door at the Warburg Library with Mnemosyne, memory, over it on the lintel in Hamburg and here in London. The idea of memory, of course, fundamental to Warburg's project. But even as she helped create a space of memory, Bing was very much aware, you find this in the correspondence, that Warburg's memory was fading. People didn't know his work. As early as 1945, she reflected to a friend from Hamburg days, and this is Walter Solmitz, who had ended up in Bowdoin College in Maine. She, as I said, so she was writing to him and she said, maybe Warburg will be one of those whose true image lives on only in the hearts of his friends and dies with them. So she could never have anticipated the Warburg Renaissance. She just thought it's going to drift away. And Solmitz in the 1950s acknowledged the great changes in the Institute, owing not only to the British presence, but very particularly to the rise of Vienna in the person of Ernst Gombrich. As I say, Bing's successor, obviously one of the great art historians of the 20th century, who had grave doubts about the premises of A.B. Warburg's project, as we also know. So I think I'll end by bringing up Roger Hinks again. In his journals, and also in reviews he wrote at the time of the move into this building, he ruminated about the Warburg, and he thought about the Warburg and Courtauld. And he clearly saw them as separate but complementary in their ways. He set up a series of binaries, and I think many of us have thought in such relations. In his view, and I don't know would use his terminology, it was the difference between art history and iconology. And that means that Panofsky's methodological moniker had become ubiquitous. The Courtauld, he said, studied the image, the Warburg, the symbol. He described the Warburg Institute as, quote, a laboratory for the investigation of historical processes which lie on the borderline of other disciplines, and also, quote, a body dedicated to the study and interpretation of historical processes through visual images, which I think is actually quite spot on. Unusual. It wasn't that it is the survival of the classics, but something more richer than that. Related to, but richer than that. I think in today's terms, we might speak of the difference between Kunst and Bildwissenschaft. So let's end with a what-if question, another what-if question. What might have happened if, after the new Warburg was opened, ongoing plans to set the Courtauld alongside had been implemented, plans that were still alive into the 1960s? Would there have been more sharing? Would there have been more mutual impact? Or would individuals simply have entered the entrance proper to their research trajectory? Jacques Sol in 1936 wrote emphatically to Lord Lee, "Complete amalgamation can therefore not be contemplated, whereas collaboration seems to be the obvious course of action, and this still seems to be the crux of the matter." Thank you.
Well, this was a good evidence of that collaboration. Thanks to you. Also, thanks for teaching us so much. I mean, I think Alex last time said it was a bit like learning a lot about your own family, and there is something about that. It runs deep, but I think it's not just for those of us who work at the Warburg or the Courtauld or both, but also people who think about these questions of migration and method and interdisciplinarity and the many oppositions that they were grappling with, I think, are still very much in dynamic play at the moment. So really timely reflection, especially for us who are thinking so much about this building and about, well, actually both institutes are in the middle of planning building projects. So a lot of collaboration on that front. It's very hot in here, so let's have a couple of questions and then we can move downstairs and have a drink and maybe even go outside into that courtyard with its fanciful trees. Now we have lovely birch trees, but does anyone want to start us off?
We have some people who really have known. I mean, Michael Kaufman, director of the Courtauld, who took it over into the Somerset House.
When I was doing my thesis, Courtauld said, "Go to the Courtauld and see how the others do it."
And you did. You started at the Warburg, though, and then made your way through BA to Courtauld.
This was as a postgraduate here.
Yeah. So, anybody have thoughts about drawing from your own experience, or what's worked or what hasn't worked, or just out questions? Well, I had to try.
I haven't got a question, but I have got a comment, which is, when you go through things in the archive, it's extraordinary the extent to which it doesn't look like wartime, it doesn't look like the build-up to the war. Everything seems to be going nicely, and that's not what I would have thought, looking back after 20, 30 years.
They kept writing their letters. They were trying so hard to keep things going on. I think there's a letter by Gombrich who says that when he went out to Denham to do some work, it helped him to remember that Dürer is more interesting than Goebbels. So they were clinging to it. But on the other hand, when Saxl had to come from Uxbridge in to here, they were afraid of death. It was a very, very frightening thing. There's a letter by Bing to, in fact, Solmans, and she writes in German, which is interesting because they moved so much over into English by that time in '45, talking about now I can say it, now I can say how depressing it was, now I can say how dismal and how frightening it was and how much tension one lived under. It's as though they were keeping themselves just kind of, I don't know, cocooned in work to the degree they could, but it was debilitating. Yeah.
Just a little follow-up. There was a second attempt to gain Panofsky to the Warburg directorship after Saxl died. No? So
For the directorship.
Yes, for the directorship. So I've forgotten like what the circumstances and if the Courtauld was involved in that, probably not. But,
I don't think so. I think, yeah, they
but there was
were
no
so
chance,
sad
no?
because when Edgar Vint left, he was going to be the next director. There was no question. As late as 43, 44, that was assumed, and they had a big falling out. And he never came back from America, or only later by way of Oxford. But they were looking, they were trying to get Klibanski, they were trying to get Krautheimer, they were trying to get any of their old friends who knew Hamburg ways, who understood the German system from the inside. And so Panofsky just cordially said no, but that's actually exactly right to say. Yeah.
I've got a question which is probably almost impossible to answer, but you've
Okay.
just touched on it. It's to do with the shift in language, which has been rather skirted around. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, they continued to write in German for a good long time, and particularly to the emigres all over. But more and more and more they shift, and by the end of the war, you rarely find them writing in English, even when in German, even when they obviously could have, when they're two natives. I think people had gone over. Some did it as a matter of principle. I think many, it was just a matter of convenience and trying to move over. It can be symbolic, it can be practical, and it would depend. Some people felt very strongly.
What about something deeper, the actual concepts embedded in the German language, which are very difficult to translate?
No.
I mean, that's
We all
big
know how
question.
to translate Constable, yeah. Yeah. But they're, there are things to say about what happened. I could just mention what is so well known. Panofsky is so often quoted as having said that having to use English made him write in a more clear manner. I think there's an awful lot lost. Anybody who knows both languages, even to some degree, realizes, there are things you can't say in English, these wonderful German compound words. So there would have been constant frustration. But the emigres, you see such a range. I've read through a lot by a lot of people, and you realize that temperaments are so different. The degree of suffering is so different. I remember was at the emergency committee files in New York Public Library, doesn't matter, but it was Hans Baron, who was a historian of Florentine history, and there are these little cards, and in one, which were interview cards, in which the interviewer is giving impressions as they're trying to sort things out. And the poor man, he came in later life, I think, and he was teaching at Queens College in New York, and this would have been for students who knew had nothing of the background of his own students. And written on the interview card was, "This is a ruin of a man." Those things are so sad. But then Edgar Breitenbach, he was such a cheery man, so he gets out of Germany and he's in California picking fruit and being a postman and writing a catalog of folk art and all this until he becomes a citizen and a monuments man and ends up in charge of a photograph and film department at the Library of Congress. So the lives are just really quite extraordinary as these people, as the diaspora goes on, and some suffer so badly. But language is a part of that, leaving your language behind and your modes of thought and having to translate constantly. Yes?
Tony.
You've spoken a lot about kind of approach and methods. Have you come across anything about resources in the two institutes? About was there any impact on the Warburg's approach to how to organise its resources? The 4 floors. Did that have any impact on how the Courtauld was going to think about its library? Did they share? Was there an agreement early on? I know of kind of informal agreements about sharing books, but was there any thought about how to distinguish between the two buildings?
Maybe you can say, I can't say much, but I could not imagine for half a second that the Courtauld books would be arranged in anything like the Warburg manner. and nor the Courtauld collections, which we all used in the days when you would just go through and learn your images that way. This was iconographic. When Rudolf Wittkover was brought in 1934, he was put in charge of the photographic collection. Jennifer's here, who knows so much more, was tasked with making the photographic collection correspond more closely to the sequences and the kind of thinking embedded in the library. So I think that it would have had to have been kept separate. I think it would have been very interesting to have had a Witt and a Conway library and an art historical library, particularly as we know that I think you always said that the Byzantine books were bought by the Warburg, right? So that the Courtauld wouldn't have to. And so there was that kind of merging and collaboration. And so I imagine that would have meant people would move across. Yeah.
I was wondering, is there a broader context to this division between the Courtauld approach and the Warburg approach, as you stated it, in that within art history there's still lots of tensions between a more empiricist approach and what's seen as a continental, perhaps more theoretical approach. And it seems that what you're telling me is that Warburgers at this stage, if we can call them that, wanted to stand away from any political discussion. And whereas in Europe, if you go back to the continent, you then are faced with the semiologists, you're faced with the deconstructionists, and all of this new art history, as it was called in the 70s and 80s, which really came up against this more empiricist approach to art history. And it seems that the Warburg fits into that with the Courtauld, but it's actually part of a bigger picture.
But I would have said that the continental developments within art history in the 70s and 80s did not have much purchase in the Warburg Institute. No. But in the Courtauld, as being part of international art history, well, and also were there not tensions between, say, the polytechnics and the Courtauld and certain of the other institutions. I think some felt that the new art history grows in the fringes, not in the center of art historical study in Britain. That's my sense, within the disciplinary matrix. But I think early on, absolutely, these are different modes of interpreting images. Continental out of its philosophical roots, and the Courtauld, certainly out of the needs of connoisseurs and museum people and so on, very legitimate, and art criticism. I think it was changing, and the field was changing. It kind of, in a certain way, rides developments in art history. What does the Warburg do, though? It's such an oddity here, an interdisciplinary organization. It's not part of an international anything to some degree. It becomes.
Was it the cause of this in Europe?
Well, I've begun to think. The Warburg Institute comes over. A.B. Warburg is an idiosyncratic individual, and there's an admirable mission that I think is appealing to many, many people today. But this is not mainstream German art history. This is not Berlin department coming over.
Surely there's a contrast between the Welflin tradition and that seems to fit also this general clash.
Yeah, well, I think there are many ways. There are many spokes and prongs you could look at. I think it's an interesting and complex story. And teasing out the history is one side of it, and I think you're getting at moving forward in time. And I think that ultimately is the important thing. I think historiography is always to help us denaturalize assumptions that we live by, and to realize this didn't have to be, it was historically contingent. My God, I'm living my life and it's historically contingent. that's something we've all found, right? But also, there are some very good ideas in the past, and I think that they can be mobilized. Revival, look at the Italian Renaissance, worked quite well. You can go back, resuscitate, change around, create a golden age story, and do something interesting. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I think it's a matter of going forward and just making things richer, more interesting, playing off of the materials you have at your disposal to, just spark thought and make historical interpretation more lively, more relevant, more engaging in the present. And I think there are some good ideas back there to look at.
I think that's the perfect note. I think we can all drink to that. So that's